What no one in courtroom 4 understood that morning was that the quiet woman in handcuffs was not afraid of the man standing in front of her. She was afraid of what would happen if she stopped holding herself back. The room had gone still in that strange way public rooms go still when everyone senses something wrong, but no one wants to be the first to name it. Fluorescent lights hummed over the polished wooden benches. The flag behind Judge William Harrington hung perfectly motionless. A clerk's fingers hovered above her keyboard. Two bailiffs stood near the side wall, watching the docket move with the tired patience of people who had seen hundreds of bad mornings pass through that same room. At the center of it all stood Denise Carter, 34 years old, 5'7", dressed in a county-issued jumpsuit that made everyone look smaller than they were. Her wrists were cuffed in front of her. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her face carried the exhaustion of a woman who had not slept, but her eyes were clear, steady, and almost too calm for the charges being read against her. Officer Brent Callahan stood a few feet away, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, wearing his uniform like it gave him ownership of every breath in the room. He had already told the judge that Denise was unstable. He had already told the prosecutor she was aggressive. He had already told anyone willing to listen that he had only done his job. But Denise had said almost nothing. That bothered him more than anger would have. Anger he understood. Tears he could use. Panic he could shape into guilt. But silence was harder to control. Judge Harrington looked down over his glasses and asked Denise if she understood the charge against her. Before she could answer, Callahan stepped closer, close enough that the bailiff nearest the rail shifted his weight. Denise did not step back. She only looked at him. And for the first time that morning, something flickered across Callahan's face that almost looked like embarrassment. He leaned in and spoke low, but not low enough. The front row heard it. The clerk heard it. Denise heard every word. Still, she did not react. Callahan's jaw tightened. The courtroom seemed to shrink around them. Every bench, every wall, every witness drawn toward the space between his uniform and her silence. Then his hand moved. A sharp sound cracked through the room, not loud enough to be thunder, but loud enough to stop every heartbeat for half a second. Denise's head turned slightly with the force of it. Someone gasped. The clerk froze. One bailiff reached for his radio. The other took one step forward. But Denise had already lifted her eyes again. No tears. No escrime. No wild movement. Just one slow breath through her nose, the kind of breath a person takes when training has replaced fear. Before anyone could understand what was happening, Callahan lost his balance and dropped hard to the courtroom floor, stunned, silent, and no longer in control of the room he thought belonged to him. Denise stepped back exactly one pace, still cuffed, still calm, and said in a voice clear enough for every person present to hear, "He touched me first." The first sound after Denise spoke was not a voice. It was the faint scrape of Judge Harrington's chair as he leaned forward. His expression caught between disbelief and the instinctive authority of a man who had spent 20 years believing every room became orderly when he demanded it. But courtroom 4 was no longer orderly. Officer Brent Callahan was on the floor, blinking up at the ceiling as if the room had moved without his permission. Bailiff Roy Mercer stopped halfway down the aisle, one hand raised, unsure whether he was looking at an attack or the end of one. Bailiff Elaine Brooks moved toward Denise first, but slower than procedure required, because Denise was not advancing, shouting, or resisting. She was standing exactly where she had stepped back, shoulders level, palms open despite the cuffs, her breathing steady enough that the people in the front row began to understand something the uniform had hidden from them. She had not lost control. She had kept it. Judge Harrington struck the bench once with his gavel, and the sound brought everyone halfway back to themselves. "Order," he said, though his voice carried less command than usual. "Everyone remain where you are." Denise did not move. Her public defender, Rachel Monroe, had risen so quickly that her file folder had slid off the table and scattered papers across the floor. "Your Honor," she said, "my client was struck in open court." Prosecutor Daniel Reeves turned pale but said nothing. He had been ready for a routine appearance, a quick argument about bail, another case moving through a crowded Monday calendar. He had not prepared for a police officer to turn the courtroom into evidence. Callahan pushed himself upright with the help of a bench. his face red with humiliation more than pain. She attacked me, he snapped, pointing toward Denise. You all saw it. She attacked an officer of the law. But the words did not land the way he expected. They hung in the room, thin and strained, because too many people had seen his hand move first. Judge Harrington looked from Callahan to Denise, then to the two bailiffs, then to the small black dome of the security camera fixed above the clerk station. For the first time that morning, the judge's eyes changed. Not softened, not yet, but sharpened. Miss Carter, he said carefully, did Officer Callahan make physical contact before you responded? Denise looked at the judge, not at Callahan. Yes, Your Honor. Did you intend to continue after he fell? No, Your Honor. Did you move toward him afterward? No, Your Honor. Rachel stepped closer to her client, her voice lower now, controlled but burning. Your Honor, I am requesting immediate review of courtroom footage before any statement by Officer Callahan is accepted into the record. Callahan laughed once, short and bitter. This is ridiculous. She is dangerous. She has been dangerous since the arrest. At that word, arrest, Denise's eyes shifted for the first time. Not with fear, with memory. The shelter porch, the cold air, the young woman crying behind her. Callahan's badge catching the streetlight. 3 nights earlier, Denise Carter had not been looking for trouble. She had been ending a double shift at the women's shelter on Maple Avenue, carrying a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour before when she heard a girl pleading outside the side entrance. That was where this really began, not in the courtroom, not with the gavel, and not with Callahan pretending the truth had started only after everyone was watching. 3 nights earlier, Maple Avenue looked almost empty under the yellow wash of the streetlights. The shelter sat between a closed laundromat and a small brick church, its windows covered with pale curtains and its front steps dusted with the first dry leaves of November. Denise Carter had worked there for almost 6 years, long enough to know the difference between an argument and a cry for help. She was locking the side entrance just after 11:30 at night when she heard a young woman say, "Please, I am not trying to cause trouble." Denise paused with the key still in the lock. Her whole body became quiet. Not tense, not afraid, quiet. It was the kind of stillness she had learned years ago, the kind that let a person listen with more than their ears. Around the corner, near the alley gate, Officer Brent Callahan stood beside his cruiser with one hand resting on his belt and the other pointed toward a girl who could not have been more than 19. Her name was Maya Lewis. Denise knew her because Maya had come to the shelter twice that week, each time wearing the same gray hoodie, each time pretending she only needed bus fare when everyone could see she needed much more. That night, Maya was shaking so badly that the paper bag in her hand kept crinkling. Callahan was speaking in a low voice, the kind of voice men use when they want the world to think they are calm while making sure the person in front of them feels small. Denise stepped into view and asked if everything was all right. Callahan turned slowly, and the moment he saw her, his expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. He had been at the shelter before, answering calls he never took seriously, rolling his eyes when women asked for reports, acting as if fear needed perfect paperwork before it deserved protection. "This does not concern you," he said. Denise looked past him at Maya. "Are you safe?" Maya opened her mouth, but Callahan answered for her. "She is fine. She is making a scene." Denise did not raise her voice. "Officer, this is shelter property. If she wants to come inside, she can come inside." Callahan smiled then, but there was no warmth in it. You people always think you know the law until the law shows up. Denise felt the old familiar heat move through the air, the kind that had nothing to do with weather. She had spent years teaching women how to recognize the moment before a person crossed a line. The lifted chin, the narrowed eyes, the smile that was really a warning. She moved one step closer to Maya, leaving plenty of space, hands visible, voice steady. "Maya, come stand by me." That was all, for simple words. But to Callahan, they sounded like defiance. He shifted his body to block the path. Denise did not push him. She did not touch him. She simply stood where she was 5'7", tired from a double shift, still holding her cold coffee, and refused to look away. For 10 seconds, no one moved. Then a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping across the alley, and Callahan seemed to remember there were witnesses in the world beyond his cruiser. His face hardened. He told Denise she was interfering with an investigation. Denise asked what crime Maya had committed. He did not answer. Instead, he reached for his radio and began creating the story that would follow Denise in a courtroom for aggressive subject, refusing lawful instruction, escalating situation. Maya whispered, "I am sorry." Denise kept her eyes on Callahan and said softly, "You do not apologize for needing help." That sentence was the first thing Callahan could not forgive. Callahan's report made everything sound clean. It said Denise Carter advanced toward him in an aggressive manner. It said Maya Lewis was uncooperative and confused. It said the officer gave multiple lawful commands before Denise interfered. It did not mention the shelter door. It did not mention the cameras under the church awning. It did not mention the way Maya kept her eyes on the ground because she had already learned that some adults only listened when the right person was afraid. By midnight, 2 more patrol cars had rolled onto Maple Avenue, their blue lights flashing across the brick wall of the shelter in slow, silent waves. Denise stood near the curb with her, hands visible, speaking only when asked, while Maya sat on the front steps wrapped in a blanket from the shelter office. The other officers treated Callahan's version like a finished story. They did not ask Denise why she had stepped outside. They did not ask Maya why she was shaking. They did not ask to see the shelter cameras. One officer, younger than the rest, looked toward Denise with doubt in his eyes, but Callahan caught the look and shook his head once. That was all it took. Doubt disappeared. Procedure took over. Denise knew that machine. She had watched it swallow women with bruised confidence and no witnesses, watched it turn survival into attitude, fear into disorder, silence into guilt. So she did what she had taught others to do. She stayed calm. She repeated facts. She gave names. She asked for her attorney. But calmness did not save her from being placed in the back of a cruiser. As the door closed, Maya stood up and tried to speak, but Callahan stepped between them and told her she could make a statement later. Denise looked through the window at the young woman and gave one small nod. It meant breathe. It meant remember. It meant this is not over. At the county holding facility, the night stretched thin and cold. Denise sat on a metal bench under lights that never dimmed, listening to doors open and close down the hallway. No one there knew she had spent years rebuilding the kind of women who arrived at the shelter believing apology was safer than truth. No one knew she had once trained 6 nights a week in a small gym behind a grocery store. Not because she wanted to hurt anyone, but because she had promised herself she would never again freeze when someone needed help. Her younger sister, Alina, had been the reason for that promise. Alina had called for help 3 times before anyone believed the danger was real. By the time the right people listened, the damage had already been done. Denise never spoke about that night unless a woman at the shelter needed to know she was not alone. After Alina was gone, Denise turned grief into discipline. She learned footwork, balance, pressure, distance, and the harder lesson beneath all of it. The strongest person in the room is often the one who can choose not to react. That was why Callahan bothered her. Not because he was loud, not because he wore a badge, because he mistook restraint for weakness. By sunrise, Denise had been photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a public defender. By Monday morning, she was led into courtroom 4, still tired, still calm, already aware that Callahan would be there. What she did not know was that Maya Lewis had not gone home after the arrest. She had gone back to the shelter office, found a night supervisor, and said 5 words that would soon change everything. Please check the camera footage. By the time courtroom 4 returned to silence, the truth was already moving toward it from 3 different directions. It was sitting on a shelter computer under a folder labeled West Entrance Backup. It was saved on the church security system across Maple Avenue, recorded from an angle Callahan had never thought to check. And it was trembling inside Maya Lewis, who had spent the entire weekend deciding whether fear was heavier than guilt. Rachel Monroe did not know any of that yet. All she knew was that her client had been struck in front of a judge, had responded with one controlled movement, and was now being treated as if standing still had somehow been a crime. Judge Harrington ordered a 10-minute recess, but nobody moved like it was a normal recess. The prosecutor gathered his papers without looking at Callahan. Bailiff Elaine Brooks guided Denise to the defense table instead of the holding door, a small choice that said more than any announcement could have. Callahan stood near the aisle, adjusting his uniform, his pride more shaken than his body. He kept repeating that Denise was dangerous, but the sentence sounded weaker each time, as if even he could hear the crack forming under it. Rachel leaned close to Denise and asked what happened on Maple Avenue. Denise looked toward the empty witness bench before answering. There was a girl. Her name is Maya. She came to the shelter. Officer Callahan did not want her inside. Rachel listened without interrupting, her pen moving quickly. Denise gave her the address, the time, the alley gate, the church across the street, every detail she had held on to during the long night in county holding. She did not embellish. She did not ask Rachel to believe her because she was innocent. She simply laid the facts down one by one, like stones across water. At the back of the courtroom, an older woman in a navy cardigan stood near the doors, clutching a manila envelope against her chest. Her name was Mrs. Evelyn Parker, the night supervisor at the shelter. She had worked with Denise for 4 years and had never once seen her raise her voice at a client, a volunteer, or a police officer, even when raising her voice would have been easier. Mrs. Parker had spent Saturday morning reviewing footage with Maya beside her. They watched the scene from the west entrance camera once, then twice, then a third time in silence. After that, Mrs. Parker called Rachel Monroe's office, left 2 messages, and when nobody answered on a weekend, she printed still images, copied the footage to a flash drive, and came to court herself. Now she stood in the doorway, waiting for someone official to notice her. Maya stood behind her, hood up, hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweatshirt, eyes fixed on the floor. She looked smaller in daylight, younger, but she had come. That mattered. When Rachel saw Mrs. Parker, she crossed the room quickly, and for the first time since the hearing began, Denise let her shoulders lower by half an inch. Callahan saw them too. His face changed before he could hide it. The confidence drained from his eyes, replaced by a calculation so quick and cold that Bailiff Brooks noticed. He stepped toward the back of the courtroom, but Judge Harrington returned from chambers before he could reach the door. "Everyone rise," the clerk called. The room stood. Denise stood slowly. Callahan stopped where he was. Judge Harrington sat, looked at the defense table, then at the officer, then at the woman holding the envelope. Something in the courtroom shifted again. The case was no longer moving on Callahan's words alone. It had witnesses now. It had timestamps. It had angles. And for a man who had built his power in the spaces where nobody was. Watching, that was the beginning of the end. Judge Harrington did not ask Mrs. Parker to sit down right away. He looked at the envelope in her hands, then at Rachel Monroe, and something about the old rhythm of the courtroom disappeared. This was no longer a routine bail hearing. It was no longer a simple report written by a man in uniform and accepted by everyone around him, because accepting it was easier than questioning it. Rachel stood and asked permission to approach the bench with newly available evidence related to the arrest. Prosecutor Reeves objected automatically, but the objection sounded tired before it was finished. Judge Harrington raised one hand and silenced him. Ms. Monroe approached. Rachel walked forward with Mrs. Parker beside her. Maya stayed near the back doors, half hidden behind the last row, but Denise saw her and gave the smallest nod. Not encouragement exactly. Recognition. The kind that said, "I know what it cost you to come here." Mrs. Parker placed the envelope on the clerk's desk and explained that it contained still images, timestamps, and a digital copy of security footage from the shelter's west entrance. Then she said there was more. A neighboring church camera had captured the street angle. Judge Harrington's face tightened. Officer Callahan shifted where he stood, no longer trying to look angry, now trying to look offended. "Your Honor," he said, "this is highly irregular." The judge turned to him slowly. "So is what happened in my courtroom." That sentence moved through the room with quiet force. Nobody smiled. Nobody whispered. But everyone felt the balance change. Rachel requested that both the courtroom security footage and the shelter footage be preserved immediately and reviewed before any further action against Denise. Reeves rubbed one hand across his forehead, realizing too late that he had built his morning on paperwork he had not tested. Judge Harrington ordered the clerk to contact court security and retrieve the recording from the last 15 minutes. Then he instructed Bailiff Brooks to take custody of the flash drive and verify the chain of possession. Callahan objected again, this time sharper, saying Denise was manipulating the room, and that the issue before the court was her conduct, not his. Denise lowered her eyes for a moment, not in shame, but because she knew that tone. Men like Callahan always try to drag the truth back into fog. They question the witness. They question the angle. They question the timing. They questioned whether Fear had remembered correctly. But cameras did not tremble. Cameras did not apologize. Cameras did not change their story because a uniform entered the room. As the clerk worked at her computer, the courtroom waited in a silence so complete that the buzz of the lights seemed louder than before. Rachel leaned toward Denise and whispered that she did not have to say anything yet. Denise answered without looking away from the judge. "I know." Across the room, Maya finally stepped out from behind the last row. Her hands were still tucked in her sleeves, but her voice, when she spoke, reached the bench. "Your Honor, I was there." Every head turned. Callahan's eyes narrowed, and for 1 second the old fear almost pulled Maya backward. Then Mrs. Parker reached for her hand. Maya took one breath and continued. She did not interfere with anything. She was helping me. Judge Harrington studied the young woman, then glanced toward Denise. The judge had seen thousands of defendants stand before him, some defiant, some broken, some guilty, some lost. But Denise Carter was none of those things. She stood like a woman who had been waiting for the room to catch up with what she already knew. The clerk finally looked up from the monitor and said the courtroom footage was ready. Judge Harrington leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Play it," he said. And in that moment, Officer Brent Callahan stopped being the author of the story. The courtroom footage began without sound, and somehow that made it worse. On the monitor beside the clerk's station, everyone watched themselves become evidence. There was Judge Harrington at the bench, leaning over the case file. There was Rachel Monroe, rising from the defense table. There was Denise Carter, standing in front of the rail with her cuffed hands held low and still. And there was Officer Brent Callahan, moving closer to her, not because procedure required it, not because the room was unsafe, but because he wanted the space between them to belong to him. At normal speed, the moment passed almost too quickly. Callahan leaned in. Denise stayed still. His hand lifted. Denise turned with the impact. Then, in one clean motion, Callahan lost balance and went down before the bailiffs reached them. The prosecutor stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. It was the same scene everyone had just lived through, yet from above it looked different. Colder, clearer, less like confusion and more like a choice. Judge Harrington asked the clerk to play it again at half speed. The room held its breath. This time, the small things appeared. Callahan's shoulder angling toward Denise. His hand closing around her cuffed wrist for less than a second. His mouth near her ear. Denise shifting her weight backward, not forward. The strike that followed. Then Denise's response, not wild, not repeated, not chasing him, only enough to stop the next movement and create distance. Bailiff Brooks looked down at the floor as if replaying her own hesitation. Bailiff Mercer swallowed hard. Rachel's face had gone pale with anger, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Your Honor, the footage clearly shows Officer Callahan initiated contact. Callahan stepped forward. That does not show what she said to me." Judge Harrington did not look away from the monitor. "It shows what you did in my courtroom." The officer's face tightened. For years, Brent Callahan had survived on the space between what happened and what could be proven. He knew how to write a report that sounded official enough to erase a trembling voice. He knew how to stand straight in a uniform while someone else looked emotional, tired, or poor. He knew how to make judges impatient, prosecutors comfortable, and witnesses uncertain. But the camera had no respect for his confidence. Judge Harrington ordered the shelter footage played next. The clerk connected the flash drive, and the monitor shifted to the grainy view of Maple Avenue at night. Denise watched without expression, but inside her chest the memory returned with the cold air and the yellow streetlights. There was Maya near the alley gate. There was Callahan beside the cruiser. There was Denise stepping from the side door with her hands visible. No sudden movement. No ruse. No threat. Just a woman walking toward another woman who looked afraid. The footage from the church angle made it even clearer. Callahan had blocked Maya's path to the shelter entrance. Denise had kept distance between them. When she pointed toward the door, she pointed with an open hand. When Callahan called in the incident, Denise was standing several feet away, holding a paper cup, not interfering with anyone. Maya began to cry silently in the back row, not because the footage was shocking, but because it proved she had not imagined the fear. Mrs. Parker put an arm around her shoulders. Rachel requested immediate dismissal of the obstruction charge and an inquiry into the arrest report. Prosecutor Reeves did not object right away. That silence was the first honest thing he had offered all morning. Callahan looked toward the doors, then toward the judge, searching for the old version of the room, the one where his word would have been enough. It was gone. Judge Harrington removed his glasses and set them on the bench. "Officer Callahan," he said, "you will remain in this courtroom. Bailiff Brooks, secure his service weapon and badge pending further order." The room did not erupt. It did something heavier. It understood. Denise closed her eyes for 1 second, not in victory, but in relief. Because the truth had finally entered the room, and this time, it had brought proof. For several seconds after Judge Harrington's order, nobody seemed to breathe. Bailiff Elaine Brooks moved first, not with force, not with drama, but with the calm precision of someone who understood that the room had crossed a line it could never uncross. Officer Brent Callahan looked at her as if she had misunderstood the world. "Elaine," he said, using her first name like a reminder of old hallway conversations and shared coffee during long shifts. She did not answer. She held out her hand. The badge first, Officer Callahan. The title sounded different now. Not powerful. Temporary. Callahan's. Jaw tightened, but he removed the badge from his uniform and placed it in her palm. The small metal shield made a soft sound against her hand, barely audible, yet every person in the room heard what it meant. Then came the service weapon, secured according to procedure, logged by the clerk, witnessed by the judge, the prosecutor, the defense, in a gallery that had gone utterly silent. Denise Carter watched without satisfaction. That was what surprised Rachel Monroe most. There was no smile on Denise's face, no flash of triumph, no hunger to see him humiliated. She looked tired, deeply tired, as if she had not wanted to be proven right, because being proven right meant the damage had been real all along. Judge Harrington turned back to the shelter footage, asking for the final 30 seconds to be played again. The grainy image filled the monitor. Maya near the gate, Callahan blocking the path, Denise standing at a measured distance. Then the moment that had been reduced in the police report to interference became something else entirely. A woman creating space. A shelter worker keeping a young person from being cornered. A citizen asking a reasonable question. The judge watched it twice, then looked down at the arrest report on his desk. The paper suddenly seemed smaller than before. "Officer Callahan," he said, "this written statement appears to conflict with 2 separate recordings and the testimony now before the court." Callahan opened his mouth, but the judge raised one hand. "Do not interrupt me." The room froze again, but this time the silence belonged to the bench. Judge Harrington continued, slower now, each word placed carefully. "The charge of obstruction against Miss Carter is dismissed pending further review. The allegation that she initiated contact in this courtroom is contradicted by the court's own footage. This matter will be referred immediately to Internal Affairs and the District Attorney's Public Integrity Unit." Prosecutor Reeves stood, looking as if he wanted to disappear into his own suit. "Your Honor, the state will cooperate fully." Rachel did not look at him. She was looking at Denise because Denise had lowered her head for 1 second, and Rachel understood that the fight had never really been about a single charge. It was about all the times people like Maya were told they were confused, all the times women at the shelter were asked why they did not leave sooner, why they did not speak louder, why they did not have proof ready in a world that rarely gave them time to collect it. Maya stepped forward when the judge called her name. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. She said Denise had opened a shelter door for her. She said Callahan told her she was wasting police time. She said Denise never touched him on Maple Avenue. With every sentence, Callahan seemed to shrink further away from the man he had been that morning. Then Mrs. Parker spoke. She told the court Denise had worked double shifts, trained volunteers, walked clients to bus stops after dark, and stayed late whenever someone was afraid to be alone. She did not mention medals or fighting records. She did not need to, but Rachel did. When the judge asked why Denise had been able to protect herself so quickly in restraints, Rachel explained that Denise Carter had once been a state kickboxing champion and later a certified self-defense instructor for women in crisis. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Denise closed her eyes briefly. That part of her life had never been a secret, but it had never been something she used to impress anyone. Rachel's voice softened. She teaches people how to survive without becoming what hurt them. Judge Harrington looked at Denise for a long moment. "Miss Carter," he said, "this court owes you a careful record." Denise lifted her eyes. "No, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Maya does." And for the first time all morning, the judge had no immediate answer. Judge Harrington adjourned the hearing with a different voice than the one he had used to begin it. The gavel came down once, not as a warning, but as a line drawn across the morning. Denise Carter's cuffs were removed at the defense table, and for a moment she only looked at her own hands, flexing her fingers slowly as if reminding herself that freedom could return quietly, without applause. Rachel Monroe gathered the dismissed paperwork, but Denise did not reach for it. She turned first toward Maya Lewis. The young woman stood beside Mrs. Parker, eyes red, shoulders still tight beneath the gray hoodie. Denise walked to her carefully, giving her space the way she always did at the shelter, never forcing comfort on someone who had already had too many choices taken away. Maya tried to say thank you, but the words caught. Denise shook her head gently. "You told the truth. That was the hard part." Across the room, Brent Callahan sat under the watch of Bailiff Brooks and Bailiff Mercer, his uniform suddenly missing the pieces that had made people step aside for him. He looked smaller without them, not because the room had changed, but because everyone could finally see the man beneath the authority. Prosecutor Reeves spoke quietly with Judge Harrington near the bench. Internal Affairs had been notified. The Public Integrity Unit was already requesting the footage. By noon, the earlier complaints against Callahan would no longer be buried in separate folders with separate excuses. They would be pulled together, compared, and read in the light. At 12:43 in the afternoon, Denise stepped out of the courthouse into cold November air. The sky above downtown Atlanta was pale and bright, and the sidewalk was crowded with reporters, courthouse staff, and people who had heard that something unusual had happened inside Courtroom 4. Denise stopped at the top of the steps. She had walked clients through doors like this before, reminding them to breathe, to keep going, to not measure justice by a single day. Now the same advice returned to her. Rachel stood on one side. Mrs. Parker and Maya stood on the other. Then Denise saw them across the plaza. Women from the shelter, volunteers, neighbors from Maple Avenue, the young officer who had looked doubtful the night of the arrest, and three people Denise did not recognize who were holding old complaint numbers written on folded paper. The story was already becoming larger than her. A reporter called out, asking if she felt like a hero. Denise looked toward Maya before answering. "No," she said. "I just happened to be the first one he tried it with in front of cameras." The microphones leaned closer, hungry for more, but Denise had no interest in becoming a headline shaped by other people. She walked down the steps and placed a hand over Maya's shoulder, light enough that Maya could step away if she wanted to. Maya did not step away. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened again, and Judge Harrington appeared briefly at the entrance, watching as the crowd parted for Denise Carter without anyone telling them to move. He would remember that sight for a long time, not because a courtroom had lost control that morning, but because control had finally been taken away from the wrong person. That evening, the shelter on Maple Avenue stayed open past midnight. Mrs. Parker made coffee. Rachel Monroe arrived with copies of the dismissal order. Maya sat near the front desk, filling out a statement in her own words. Denise stood by the west entrance, looking at the small black camera above the door, the one Callahan had ignored because he had assumed nobody in that place mattered enough to be believed. She thought of Alina then, of every call that had gone unanswered, of every woman who had learned to whisper when she should have been protected loudly. Denise took one slow breath. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, the shelter remained warm. And for the first time in many years, the silence around her did not feel like restraint. It felt like peace.